Good morning, dear colleagues, theater makers, researchers, theater goers, and friends, everybody who's listening us online. Today, in this conference entitled with hashtag Kroderdienas, we celebrate the centenary of a distinguished Latvian stage director, Oļģerts Kroders, and the 10th anniversary of Latvian theater web magazine, KrodersLV. Actually, the celebration started already in January, when we launched the online video interview cycle, Conversations about Kroders, where actors, critics, and theater people share their memories in conversations about working together with Oļģerts Kroders and the theater processes of today. Today, the conference will tackle both the creative heritage of Kroders, who has left a notable footprint in Latvian theater history, being an extraordinary personality and artist, and the web magazine as non-commercial niche medium with its challenges in the 21st century. To broaden the local contexts and to extend the centenary context in the Baltic countries, today we have an international and comparative perspective as we looked for Kroders' contemporaries and similar figures in theater world in Estonia and Lithuania. And I am truly happy to welcome today dear colleagues from Estonia and Lithuania, Professor Luule Epner and Ph.D. candidate Kristīna Steiblīte, to join us in the first session of our conference. I will present papers later by turn, but first, in order to make the recording of this session more valuable for use after the conference and to make the whole picture work together, I welcome two very dear colleagues of mine from Latvia with short presentations in English about Oļģerts Kroders and KrodersLV. As for practicalities, the questions and comments are welcome in Facebook comments below the broadcasting post, or if by participants in Zoom chat. And now I welcome first presentation, which will be in two parts, and it's called Creative Legacy of Oļģerts Kroders and its symbolic continuation, theater web magazine KrodersLV. Vēsma Lēvalde will start the presentation about the distinguished stage director Oļģerts Kroders. Vēsma, welcome.
Hello, dear colleagues. My task is to briefly introduce you to the main reason for today's conference, the creative personality of the eminent Latvian stage director Kroders. Who, in my opinion, was the leading representative of the psychological approach in Latvian theater. The personality of Kroders formed in the circles of the intelligentsia of the independent Republic of Latvia in the 1920s and 30s. Exile to Siberia in 1941 was a traumatic experience that stimulated his perception of theater as a spiritual asylum. At the same time, perception of reality had a substantial impact on his creative activities. Kroders worked in various professional theaters in Latvia for 53 years and received several national and international awards. Kroders' approach to a director's work incorporates a continuous search for a new theater language and constant innovations. In each of his creative periods, one can find something that was not common in Latvian theater before Kroders. In 1959, Kroders took the position of director in Liepājas Theatre. With the first production, the director demonstrated new searches for the stage language. The opera On the Fire by composer Jānis Kalniņš was the first staging in Soviet Latvia of an author in exile. Kroders was one of the first Latvian directors who staged a production without a curtain, in which the action takes place on the proscenium. Being a beginner in his middle-aged years, Kroders in his productions gave a chance for very young artists to prove themselves. And during his life, Kroders translated several foreign authors. The first play translated and staged by Kroders was The Little Foxes by American dramatist Lillian Hellman. Inspired by the Lithuanian director Miltinis, Kroders expressed a desire to establish a local theater studio. Unfortunately, this idea was not supported in Liepāja at that time. In 1963, Kroders attended the advanced courses of stage direction provided by the Lunacharsky State Institute of Theater Arts, GITIS, in Moscow. And after coming home, he staged Rainis tragedy Blau Wind in Vitebsk and then worked at Valmiera Drama Theater. Kroders was one of the first in Soviet Latvia who dared to break with the canon of socialist realism and portrayed the characters of literary classics on the stage without heroic overtones. He was one of the first directors in the Soviet Union who made Shakespeare's protagonists contemporary, Romeo and Juliet in 1966 and Hamlet in 1972. Kroders returned to Liepāja Theatre in 1974 as the main director, and in my view, he reached his creative peak here as an innovator. Just one example, Kroders was the first to apply postmodernist aesthetics in Latvian theatre while staging a classical play. I talk about The Seagull. He raised young actors and also gave the green light to several young directors and scenographers. He experimented differently. For example, he staged Hamlet a second time and also showed it to the audience in the ancient castle ruin near Liepāja, giving new connotations to the production. You can see Seagull and Hamlet in Grobiņa Castle. Only in the 90s, when Latvia regained independence, Kroders finally had the opportunity to work in Riga, since the former deportees were not allowed to work in the capital after their return from the exile. For several years, he has been the main director of National Theatre. Then he has worked in various theatres, also in Liepāja and Valmiera. And in 1997, he staged his third Hamlet at the National Theatre, this time in the small hall. Kroders' influence is not confined to the theatre. His memoir, I'm Trying to Be Honest, first published in 1993, can be seen as a contribution to literature about interwar Latvia and the fates of the Latvian deported to Siberia. He also published more than 60 articles in periodicals. During his last creative period, Kroders once again worked and lived in Valmiera, just separate stagings in Riga and Liepāja. It is a return to like-minded actors, a close collaboration with a great set designer Mārtiņš Vilkārsis, and a complete devotion to art. Kroders literally lives in the theatre until his death. Let's remember just a few of his last period's productions, Force Hamlet and King Lear. And at the end, some Kroders quotes about text, about Hamlet, and about the connection between theatre and life. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Vēsma. Thank you very much for this presentation. And now I pass the floor to Ieva about the continuation in writing, in online writing, theater web magazine KrodersLV.
Yes, thank you. I will move on to the theater web magazine KrodersLV. So I'm sharing my screen with you. When preparing for this conference, I of course had to take a step back from the everyday routine of leading a web magazine and think about the beginnings and the roots of this project that now has entered its 11th year. Of course, the choice of naming a web magazine after a living theater director, which was the situation here, moreover, a theater legend, was very unorthodox and brave. In 2010, the idea that a theater web magazine was necessary in Latvia was somewhere just in the air. And the father of the idea was playwright Laumas Mellēnas-Bartkevičas, who came up with the title and the main concept of Kroders.LV. At the beginning, the creators of this theater web magazine were theater critic Līga Ulberte, who was the editor-in-chief until 2017, playwright Jānis Balodis, who at that time only started his career in theater, and young theater student Anna Lange. Looking back at this point from today's perspective, we can conclude that Kroders.LV has always been a small, unified team working in close collaboration, therefore, in a symbolic way, continuing this concept of like-minded people working in close collaboration, which was close to Oļģerts Kroders himself when he worked, for example, in Valmiera theater. In Latvian theater, the significance of the name of Oļģerts Kroders doesn't need to be explained. Being a classic and therefore representing a canonical era of Latvian theater, Kroders at the same time was a very unique theater personality and a stage director who in some ways kept the status of a rebel even at the end of his life. In Latvian theater environment, the name Kroders has become a concept and a symbol for professionalism, talent, teamwork, and a democratic attitude towards life and art. These qualities also determine the concept of this theater web magazine. Kroders.LV doesn't follow any political views and has an open policy towards the individual voices of authors. For example, Kroders.LV has become a platform where upcoming theater critics can publish their first articles, therefore enriching the process of Latvian theater criticism. At the beginning, Kroders.LV was a platform for exchanging views about theater and life by, for example, expanding the idea of theater blogs written by various theater professionals, both critics, actors, directors, and so on. Since then, in the following 10 years, the web magazine has grown into a theater media that shows the process and follows the process of Latvian theater by publishing at least 3 articles a week, including express reviews about the latest premieres, interviews, discussions, and other materials. By being at the heart of the theater process, Kroders.LV represents both an academic take as well as an openness towards new forms of theater criticism and a diverse voice of theater criticism. Therefore, although the web magazine is not dedicated only to Oļģerts Kroders, it continues the idea of both professional and an experimentalist take on theater. Kroders.LV is a web magazine fully financed by the Latvian State Culture Capital Foundation. The situation of Latvian culture media has been unstable, living from project to project, from one year to the next, in some periods even not knowing whether the web magazine will continue existing. However, just this year, there has been a radical positive change. The Latvian State Culture Capital Foundation issued a new target program in order to support the field of specialized culture media. And Kroders.LV, alongside other long-standing printed or electronic culture media, has received financement to continue working the next 3 years. So the hope of a continuation is just what we need at such an unstable time like this. So thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Ieva, for the extensive presentation of our media today. And now I welcome Professor Luule Epner, who is Professor Emeritus of University of Tartu and Associated Professor of University of Tallinn, experienced theater researcher and theoretician, author of many publications. And she will uncover us the subject about Voldemāra Panso. And actually, we discussed yesterday that Luule changed a bit her title of the presentation. And well, she will explain how and why, because the previous one which is in the program, is the figure of Voldemāra Panso in Estonian theater, overestimated or underestimated. And there is a slight context about current Estonian theater researchers being quite skeptical about the figure of Voldemāra Panso or so. And therefore I asked Luule to uncover the subject, and the current title of the presentation is Voldemāra Panso, the father figure in Estonian theater. And well, let's go on. I will not make a description. Let's give the floor to Luule.
Thank you. And I start sharing my slides, and I hope to explain a bit this change of the title in the end of my presentation. But first about Voldemāra Panso. Estonians celebrated Voldemāra Panso's centenary last year, so he belongs to the same generation as Kroders, but his life remained short. He died at the age of 57. And this, of course, means that he did all his work during the Soviet era. Since he only started directing at the age of 35, his artistic heritage includes only 57 productions over a couple of decades, much less than Kroders directed. Nevertheless, Panso is generally considered to be the father figure of Estonian theatre. Who was Voldemāra Panso? He was born into a family of Estonians who had emigrated to Siberia, but the family returned to Estonia as early as 1921. His father was a blacksmith, but very keen of culture, and his mother was a housewife. First, I'd like to stress that Panso was an outstanding and colorful personality. According to himself, as a child, he wanted to become a clown. And indeed, he had a good sense of humor, an interest in what is funny in men, and an inexhaustible curiosity. But there was an alternative for the child. If it would not be possible to become a clown, he wanted to become a pastor and to preach in church. And true, Panso was captivated by the sublime and idealism as well. As a person and as an artist, he connected these extreme poles. He was full of energy and high-flying ideas, and his friend, Adolf Shapiro, you know very well, said that Panso had a French temperament. Panso graduated from Estonian Theatre School in 1941 and began his theatrical career as an actor. But according to memories, he was not exactly a great actor. As an actor, he was very expressive and theatrical, and in his youth, he performed successfully in comical shows. And then, at the age of 30, he decided to give up his acting career and went to Moscow to study directing at the famous GITIS. After graduating GITIS, he became the first fully professional stage director in Estonian theatre. For about the first 10 years, Panso directed in different theatres. But in 1965, he became one of the founders and the first artistic leader of the new theatre, the Youth Theatre in Tallinn. Today, this theatre is called Tallinn City Theatre. And in the 1970s, Panso was an artistic leader of Tallinn Drama Theatre. At GITIS, his teachers were Alexei Popov and, more importantly, Maria Knebel, who had trained with Stanislavski. And this quite direct connection with Stanislavski's legacy is commonly considered as a key factor in Panso's work. He was crucial to Estonian theatre of 1950s and 60s because he practiced Stanislavski's theatre aesthetics in a poetic, playful, and deeply psychological key. And his style, that of psychological realism, contrasted sharply the official style of socialist realism and was perceived as fresh and innovative. As I mentioned, Panso was curious, and this applies to theatrical matters too. So in the 1950s, he took interest in Brecht's epic theatre and directed the first, maybe the second, there are different data, but in any case, one of the first Brecht's play in the Soviet Union, Herr Puntila and his servant Matti. As a director, Panso claimed that a really good theatre performance must rely upon three I's: information, meaning story and relationships between characters. Spectators should understand what is going on stage. Second, interpretation, a director's understanding of the play or a message he attempts to convey, and improvisation, which was for Panso actually creative acting. His own style was very much based on two more I's: intuition and imagination. It is also noteworthy that Panso was very demanding regarding literary texts. As a matter of fact, he largely managed to avoid the usual Soviet repertory. He believed that classical literature is a most valuable material for the theatre, and indeed classics made up about half of his personal repertory: Shakespeare, Ibsen, Shaw, Schiller, etc. As to Estonian classics, his favorite was definitely Anton Hansen Tammsaare, and Panso called Tammsaare Shakespeare of a peasant culture, referring to Estonian indigenous culture. He adapted and directed 4 out of 5 volumes of Tammsaare's major work, Truth and Justice. And when we take a look at the titles of his adaptations, then we can see that the intention of Panso was to highlight philosophical or universal aspects of the novel, while stage adaptations prior to Panso had been focused just on the story and characters. The adaptation of the first volume was supposed to be titled Man and Land, but Panso died before he could bring it to stage. And of the contemporary Estonian playwrights, he collaborated most closely with Johann Smuul. These productions of Tammsaare and of Smuul and of other Estonian playwrights were in Soviet time essential not only artistically, but also because they maintained and at the same time reinterpreted Estonian national identity. And I have some pictures about Hamlet with Ants Eskola as Hamlet and different Tammsaare's characters on stage in Panso's productions. Panso also brought a number of new genres and forms to Estonian theatre, significantly enriching the theatre landscape of the time. For example, he directed one of the first musicals in Estonia. He adapted to the stage Pushkin's novel in verse, Yevgeny Onegin, and poetry of Estonian classics. He even compiled and directed a collage, kind of very, very fragmented collage to portray the era, 1960s, titled You My Time, and described in the program as Nylon Review with poetry, information and film. And film was also a very novel thing in Estonian theatre, on Estonian theatre stage. Panso made a couple of productions in so-called found spaces, which was novel at that time, for example, in Kadrioru Palace. Many of his productions were designed by a talented scenographer, Mari-Liis Küla, his wife, and therefore these performances were also visually impressive and imaginative. And to sum all this up, Panso proved with his work that it is perfectly possible to combine figurative techniques and rich imagery with psychological realism, which definitely remained the very basis of his productions. As is typical of psychological theatre, Panso was most concerned with an in-depth analysis of characters and their relationships, and hence he believed that an actor is of paramount importance for the theatre. I have not mentioned yet that Panso wrote also several articles and essays about the theatre, and he even defended the candidate of art studies degree, and remarkably, his thesis was about acting, which titled Work and Talent in Acting. Such a strong emphasis on an actor and acting can explain why Panso's work and impact as a teacher are probably as important or even more important than his role as a director. And when we speak about Panso as a father figure, then his work as a teacher in theatre school is most essential, I think so. Largely on his initiative, the theatre school was founded in 1957 at the Tallinn Conservatoire, and this restarted formal actor training after an almost 10-year break, and more importantly, was actually the first theatre school in Estonia that offered higher education, of course, based on Stanislavski's system. Panso ran the theatre school only until 1977, but even today it is generally known as School of Panso, and every year on his birthday, one student is awarded the Panso Award. And here you can see Panso in classroom. But in Estonia, there has been talk about School of Panso in more broad and general sense. Concept of school can refer to theatre makers whose work and artistic principles are similar, and similar to those of a particular leader. And School of Panso, in this sense, refers to the fact that today's Estonian theatre has been shaped and still is being shaped by his students and his students' students, since most of today's actors and directors have studied at the theatre school he founded and in which he taught. This school is claimed to be a Panso-style school of psychological realism that creatively continues Stanislavski's tradition. And tradition seems to be a key word here. Panso is seen as a creator of the tradition of psychological theatre in Estonia, who in turn took over the international tradition. I would quote Merle Karusoo, Panso's student, who said last year, "Everything that is good in Estonian theatre comes from Voldemāra Panso, because he brought us through his personality, Russian and German theatre culture in the global dimension and the experience of his Estonian teachers in the local dimension." And returning to my initial theatre, this sounds a bit like overestimating Panso to me. But finally, I would quote another theatre researcher. Just as a father cannot be a father without a son, No tradition can become a tradition without those who swim against the current or innovators. Panso's work predominated Estonian theatre landscape of the 1950s and 60s, but soon a kind of clash of father and sons happened. I mean the famous theatre renewal in Estonia in the late 1960s, the major aesthetic change from realism to modernism or even to postmodernism, when the main innovators were Evan Hermaküla, who never studied at State Theatre School, and Jaan Tooming, who was actually Panso's student. Panso did not approve nor understand this new avant-garde aesthetics, differently from Kroders, I think. And his conflict with young directors and actors, with sons, was quite sharp and unfortunate. And perhaps this clash, opposition of psychological realism as represented by Panso's work, and modernist, postmodernist alternative to it, has left its mark on the Estonian theatre landscape, which continues to this day. And that is why we can speak about or discuss overestimating or underestimating of Panso. Actually, this is discussion about aesthetics, realistic psychological aesthetics, or more modernist, postmodernist, post-dramatic aesthetics. But this is already a new story. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this really detailed and interesting insight in Voldemāra Panso's legacy and heritage, and the way he rooted Estonian theatre, although, as I understood at your last sentences, that there has been a postmodern turn in the late 60s. And so probably that's also the reason of this kind of underestimation, overestimation issue. We will have several questions in the end of the session. But now we will pass to our Lithuanian neighbor, to Kristīna Steiblīte, who will give her presentation entitled Moving Forward. And I believe it is both in literal and in other sense, because we are dealing with a pioneer of contemporary dance on Lithuanian scene, Kīra Katerīna Daujotaite, who had similarly to Kroders a long and, as I understand, also creative life, very long creative life. And the other subject Kristīna will tackle in her presentation will be probably shortly linked or not, she will say herself, about the online web magazine of Lithuania, Artistic Critics, Resource Manufacture. Kristīna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lauma. First of all, I want to explain shortly why I'm speaking about Kīra Katerīna Daujotaite and not some theater director, because she was not a professional choreographer who created a lot of dance performances in Lithuanian theater, but she was a key figure that was very important and still is important, that shaped current Lithuanian theater. Well, mainly dance, but also theater. So I chose to speak about her because she was the only real contemporary of Kroders that I could find. The other Lithuanian theater directors are mainly 10, 15 or years older or younger than Kroders. So there are no real his contemporaries in Lithuanian theater that made the visible impact. So now starting speaking about the Kīra Katerīna Daujotaite herself. So before speaking about her and her impact to theater, I will want to give you some context what was happening in the interwar period Kaunas. Kaunas was Lithuanian capital at the time, and it had quite a busy cultural life. Though this life, especially in the 20s, was not necessarily very diverse or exciting. More diversity in styles and aesthetics was emerging in the 30s, when a lot of artists who studied abroad were coming back to Lithuania and introducing new styles from Paris or from Germany or from other countries. Even from Russia, there were directors coming from Russia also to work in theater. In dance, the only dance style that was popular, except for ballroom dances and dances that were not professional, just for entertainment, was ballet. It came to Lithuania from Russia, and even after declaring in the 19th century, and even after declaring the independence, was still mainly performed by Russian dancers. There were even some public opinion expressed that Lithuanians did not possess any skills necessary to dance, and especially to dance ballet. So the dancers all were Russian ballerinas. Nevertheless, in late 30s, ballet was already established and popularized, and there even were some Lithuanians dancing. So there were some younger artists looking for new alternatives. One of them was Danutė Nasvytytė, who went to Germany, Berlin, to dance, to study dance in Jutta Klamt's Expressionist Dance School. And in 1939, graduating from the school, she came back to Lithuania, to Kaunas, and performed her first solo performance in state theater. She danced barefoot with loose clothes, loosely expressing herself, as mostly improvising, and this was performed on the same stage where usually ballets were performed. So it was a stark contrast from what Lithuanian audiences and artists knew. In the same year, Nasvytytė established her Expressionist Dance School. It was not just dance, it's also for gymnastics, but the dance was the main part of it. And her school operated till 1944, when the coming second Soviet occupation forced Danutė Nasvytytė to leave Lithuania, and she moved gradually to Australia, where she continued her work. But in Lithuania stayed her pupils, and one of them was Kira Katerina Daujotaitė. She joined Nasvytytė's studio as soon as it opened in 1939 and danced there till its closing. She, as a young girl in Kaunas, she started studying French language, but the war stopped that. And after war, she studied rhythmic gymnastics and then taught physical education in several higher education schools. And her profession was actually physical education teacher. But even though she was professionally physical education teacher, she continued the teachings of Kira of Danutė Nasvytytė in her own studio that she established. This was not professional. This was not very looked forward to. Nobody was very happy that she was continuing the teachings of Nasvytytė, but they still allowed it because it was kind of amateurish. So she started teaching in 1944, and gathered a group of young girls and worked as mainly a teacher of young girls. In 1954, she left Kaunas to live with her husband, former Lithuanian army officer, who was deported to Norilsk. Even there, where she had no real reason to be, only just to join her husband, she found a group of people to choreograph and worked as a dance teacher until she came back to Lithuania in 1957. After coming to Lithuania, she continued to work in the studio she established. And in 1969, celebrating the 21st and 5th anniversary of the studio, it was named Sonata after the performance they danced. The studio was named one of the best studios, one of the best amateur collectives in Soviet Lithuania. So it was guaranteed support, guaranteed continued work, but nevertheless, they had no opportunity to become professionals. Though as a 25th anniversary gift, and also through some manipulations, the dance studio Sonata was able to go to summer school of Greta Paluka in 1969, where they saw how modern and contemporary dance changed from what they were doing, because they were continuing the interwar tradition of expressionist dance, and the modern dance in all other places of the world was changing rapidly. So what they were doing was this clutching to what they learned from Nesvetita, who learned from Jutta Klemt, who learned from Isadora Duncan. So this dance was quite shaken in 1969, when they saw what's happening in the world, but still they continued, and this shakeup created one of the contemporary Lithuanian dance theaters, one of the most important, Aura. But I'll get to that gradually. So expressionist dance, could only be practiced in Soviet Union as non-professionally. It was one of the reasons was that it was closely tied to Western art that was influential and important in Lenin's times, but mostly banned by Stalin. Modern dance ideas also were tied to interwar and memories of independence. So choosing to dance something else than ballet or folk was quite rebellious. On the other hand, Daujotaitė worked only with school girls, sometimes university students, so they were not a real threat to Soviet government. But Daujotaitė studio managed to achieve was not the artistic goals maybe that the other presenter directors achieved, but she created a space for artistic young girls to experience something other than Soviet norms and express themselves without restrictions. She choreographed most of the dances herself, but after several years in her studio, girls were also allowed the opportunity to choreograph and also improvise more, to stage performances together with their teacher. So this sparked, together with the influence of visiting Paluka's summer school, influenced one of the students of Daujotaitė, Birutė Letukaitė, in 1977 to leave Sonata and create her own studio and dance company. And in 1982, it was already called Aura. It is now one of the most important Lithuanian contemporary dance theaters. So also what's important that through Daujotaitė, with the creative spark of that she inspired to young people, not only Letukaitė became the professional dancer and professional choreographer. There were more her pupils that became professional dancers and choreographers, but Letukaitė was the one who not only created a theater, but she also created first Lithuanian in Lithuania international contemporary dance festival that started in 1989 and is still continuing. So this international festival and international festival culture overall is highly influential to Lithuanian theater, even though we're speaking about dance. Especially the huge impact could be seen to the younger theater directors in the beginning of 21st century, when contemporary theater and contemporary theater festivals, international festivals in Lithuania were not as inspiring as they used to be in the beginning of the independence. So then the younger theater makers turned to dance, and one of the two main festivals that they were looking new ideas from was Aura's festival. So through Daujotaitė, though she was not a professional theater maker, we have this link between the interwar avant-garde and contemporary Lithuanian dance and theater. And she was the link that moved everything forward from the interwar to contemporary Lithuanian theater. So that would be shortly about Kira, Katerina Daujotaitė, and then I'll present Manufactura as the only website in Lithuania that is dedicated only to performing arts, mainly theater, but sometimes there are texts about the dance and other or circus. It was established in 2005 as a project of newly opened venue Menuspustuvė. Menuspustuvė opened in 2002 in the former printing house in the center of Vilnius. It was an empty industrial building, and there were people that decided it was a perfect place to start making theater independently for independent theater makers. So after making a non-representative opinion poll in one of the websites, news websites, the young theater critics decided that there is a need for the website, and they made it firstly as a database of Lithuanian contemporary theater, collecting information about new performances, theater makers, and also collecting all the reviews that were published in other publications. Manufactura still does that. They still collect all the texts from other major cultural publications, but also there is growing amount of original text published, written and published for Manufactura. The original editor of the website, Vaidas Jauniškis, was also responsible for recruiting a lot of authors that did write and still write to the website. He was teaching and still is teaching in Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theatre, and he was recruiting his students to write to Manufactura. About 10 years ago, when I first published my text in Manufactura, I felt really like this, finally, I'm the real critic. It was this cultural sense that to publish there meant that you are a part of this conversation about theater in Lithuania. Unfortunately, nowadays, studying theater and researching theater is becoming less popular. So we have issues finding new authors. And there are fewer and fewer people writing about theater nowadays. On the other hand, the people who created Manufactura and who are still writing to Manufactura are the people who move the conversation about Lithuanian contemporary theater forward and create the public discussion, not just about performances that you can see on stage, but also the Lithuanian cultural life, Lithuanian cultural politics, and everything related to Lithuanian culture, not just theater. Also, I want to mention that even though Manufactura is now more than 15 years old, it's not stagnant, it's always changing. And though there are some columns that are very old, for example, reviews or interviews. There is one new column that was created this year, and it's called Research. One of new people working with Manufaktura, Aušra Kaminskaite, decided that she wants to have a column dedicated directly to journalistic and scientific theater research, and this column only has yet two texts there, but still it's a new direction that is very interesting to see. Other important part of Manufaktura that I think is important to you, to the audience from other countries than Lithuania, is its English page. It's not very active or very big, but it was started in 2005 together with the main page of the Manufaktura. It unfortunately stopped its activity in 2006, but continued in 2014 and is publishing every year 4 to 5 new original text about contemporary Lithuanian performing arts. Yes, oh, sorry, my time is very overdue, so I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. Well, this is when you have two subjects in one, and otherwise we would make another session with papers dedicated to the resources. However, thank you very much for this insight in Kira Katerina Daujotaitės inheritance, and also in giving enlightening of Manufaktura's work already for 15 years. It's been 15 years already. We are celebrating 10, so I mean, you are the pioneers in the field, in a way. Well, we've got 5 minutes for short questions and short discussions. First of all, I had a pure curiosity, and we have also a few questions from our colleagues here in Zoom about Voldemāra Panso's. There's a question about how Panso interpreted Hamlet, and I would extend this question even further about the Panso's aesthetics and in relation with contemporariness, say so, about here and today. And another question is which we already discussed before the conference. However, I would love Luule to repeat: is there a specialized electronic theatre media in Estonia or other platforms of theatre critic online? Luule, could you please?
Yes, first about Hamlet. This was definitely a contemporary interpretation, and visually this production was very modern. Designed by Mari-Liis Küla, of course, metal and leisure and so on, visually very impressive. For Panso, Hamlet was first of all an intellectual, a humanist, and the main conflict was between free spirit and repressive or totalitarian power. But I'd like to emphasize that this production was not overtly political. It was not anti-Soviet in no way. There were rather some associations with fascism. But Hamlet was played by Ants Eskola, who was almost 60, 58 years or so. And this might be one reason, but not the only one, why a quite large part of young spectators actually were not very happy with this Hamlet. This was not their own Hamlet. But even more generally, Panso's interpretations of classics were contemporary, but not too contemporary, I'd like to say. Actors didn't wear contemporary costumes, rather these costumes and visual side was more universal, modern, but not with direct references to contemporary time. And as I said, Panso was not political. His interpretations were contemporary, but not sharply political. And now about this second question, I'd like to add some things. We have in Estonia online lexicon, biographical lexicon of Estonian theatre people. We are just completing it. It's not ready yet. But in general, we have few electronic channels and electronic resources. I can add that we have an organization called Estonian Theatre Agency. It's online and it's collecting, it collects theatre statistics of all kinds. And these statistical data are available online via homepage of Estonian Theatre Agency. But about the theatre critics, theatre criticism, it is generally published in journals and so on. Online, we have, of course, blogs. I think you in Latvia have these online internet blogs as well.
Well, thank you. Actually, yes, kind of Kroders also arose from idea of theater blog and turned into web magazine in the time. So it is how it worked. Thank you very much. And I really would like to continue the discussion since it's a pleasure to have you, although online here, but we are like time is pressing us in a way. I have a quick question to Kristīna regarding this inheritance. Kira Katerina Daujataite burst from First Republic through Soviet times to the 90s after regaining the independence, and particularly to the factor that she was accepted as a part of amateur arts, say so. I know that you are familiar with pantomime theater in Latvia with Modris Tenisons and Ansis Rūtentals, what they did. Is it somehow comparable in a way, although the dance aesthetics might be different or working style?
It's somewhat comparable, but what was this inner struggle for Daujataite was that she could not call herself a professional in Soviet Lithuania because she didn't study dance. So she was not allowed to work professionally, only amateurly. So aesthetically, there could be similarities, especially similarities with the non-conformist and non-political movement. But otherwise, they were very separate because she only worked with the schoolgirls, so with the children, with the teenagers. And it could never perform on the same level as Modris Tenisons did, for example, in the State Theater in Kaunas and in Vilnius previously.
Okay. Well, thank you. I really deeply thank our colleagues from Lithuania or Estonia. It's been a pleasure to have you here. And we look forward for your papers in written form to publish them in our compendium.